Quantifying the demand on the infrastructure that makes a city work is a way to visualize just how large the impact of urbanization really is. So let's put this demand on infrastructure into numbers. Urbanization is described as a demographic, ecological, sociological, and economic phenomenon. It is demographic because it relates to the people and the structure of populations, their size and their distribution, which also entails their spatial and temporal changes in response to factors such as birth, migration, aging, and death. It is ecological because it is concerned with the relation of living organisms, including people, with one another and with their physical surroundings. This includes life's processes, interactions, and adaptations, and more importantly, the movement of materials and energy through living communities. It is sociological because it describes people's relationships, interactions, and cultures, so more generally, it is a backdrop for all spheres of human activity. It is also economic because it provides the landscape for the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, thereby creating wealth and prosperity for city dwellers. As a phenomenon, urbanization has the potential to either stimulate growth or hinder it in neighborhoods, towns, and cities. Physical growth in urban settings is demonstrated by outward expansion or densification, either by inward compacting or upward high-rises. Taking the image of Los Angeles from above, as shown here, this is an example demonstrating the concepts of physical growth, showing the outward expansion all around the city, the compaction of the center as shown in the center of the image, and upward high-rises, again, the tall buildings in the downtown core also in the center of the image. African cities have been characterized by massive and uncontrolled spatial expansion, technically known as urban sprawl. The image here is an aerial view of Johannesburg demonstrating this urban sprawl. The physical growth of cities in Africa suggests that urban sprawl results in unsustainable land development and often encroaches on the surrounding urban areas and transforms adjacent agricultural lands into urban land use. Nearly all urban areas in Africa are expanding, on average twice as fast as their populations. Drawing on the work of Kobina and colleagues, they report that the built-up urban areas in Africa, which was 33,025 kilometers squared in 2000, would increase by 590% over the next 3 decades. As it stands, this is the highest rate of increase in urban land cover in the world. Looking at the table here produced by Kobina et al., many African cities have experienced very rapid physical expansion, and they claim that this has chipped away their resilience. This table shows 7 African cities and a side-by-side comparison of their built-up areas in 1994 and in 2008. So within a 14-year range, the rate of expansion is presented in kilometers squared per year and as a percentage increase. The 7 cities listed in descending size of the built-up area are Johannesburg in South Africa, Cairo in Egypt, Nairobi in Kenya, Lagos in Nigeria, Harare in Zimbabwe, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and Takoradi in Ghana. Taking a look at the cities one by one, Johannesburg, with the largest built-up area, increased from 1,372 kilometers squared to 1,645 kilometers squared between 1994 and 2008. That's almost a 20% increase. During the same time period, Cairo increased by 202.6%, Nairobi by 191.1%, Lagos by 53.8%, which is almost a doubling, Harare by 155.2%, Freetown by 24.5%, and Takoradi by 262.9%, which is by far the largest percentage increase of the 7 cities listed here. There is a risk that certain cities in Africa may not perform optimally in terms of their capacity to absorb rapid urban population growth and manage the impacts of increasing use of cars, respond to aging infrastructure, and meet the needs of the residents, in addition to providing services for the people. Reflecting precisely on water supply and sanitation as a key infrastructure in Africa, and recognizing that the challenges of water supply and sanitation in urban Africa are evidenced by inadequate potable water supply, where 60% of the population live in areas where water supply is inadequate, and by inadequate sanitation, generally referring to the provision of facilities and services for the safe disposal of solid and liquid wastes, which is necessary for improving and protecting health and well-being. The sub-Saharan region in Africa has the lowest access to improved sanitation in the world, revealing that 5 out of every 10 urban residents are without adequate sanitation, and that number is projected to reflect 2.4 billion urban residents by 2020. Also by Kobina et al., this table here shows the increase in the urban population fraction of 12 countries in Africa, and their improved access to water supply and sanitation reported as a percentage increase across 2 decades, reported in 1990, 2000, and 2011. The 12 countries are Burkina Faso, Congo, Côte d'Ivoire, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, Kenya, Liberia, Mali, Malawi, and Morocco, and they're just listed alphabetically. In terms of water supply, rapid urbanization in Africa has resulted in a gap between demand and supply of safe drinking water, as the capacity of service providers is stretched. Recent studies indicate that water supply across urban areas of Africa is often intermittent and tends to serve only a fraction of the urban population. At the country level, access to water supply has improved considerably over the past 2 decades across Africa. For example, in 2000, African countries such as Egypt, Morocco, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire had over 95% of their urban population with improved access to water. However, as shown in the table, this means very little to many African countries, including Ghana, Ethiopia, Guinea, Kenya, and Liberia, where less than 40% of their urban populations have access to improved water supply. In terms of sanitation, the challenges in urban Africa are largely driven by poor disposal of human excreta and solid waste. The authors report that some urban residents use pit latrines, bucket latrines, or are without sanitation facilities, in comparison to having improved latrines, including septic tanks. In Lagos in Nigeria, deteriorating sanitation conditions went from 40% in 1990 to 33% in 2011, as shown in the table, which emphasizes the poor state of sanitation in Lagos. In terms of solid waste disposal, there are similar findings. There were 105 illegal dump sites in the city of Lagos in Nigeria in 2000. In addition, close to 35% of the 1,800 tons of solid waste generated daily in Accra and Ghana in 2000 were uncollected. And in Tanzania, only 100 tons out of the 2,000 tons of solid waste generated in Dar es Salaam in 1990 were effectively managed, due to limited capacity of city authorities. Although these studies were undertaken over a decade ago, they provide a useful basis for understanding the current trends of low progress made towards improving water supply and sanitation in urban Africa. The majority of African countries have made limited progress over the past 2 decades in terms of improving access to sanitation for urban residents. Between 1990 and 2011, countries including Burkina Faso, Congo, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Kenya recorded less than 10% improvement in access to sanitation in their urban areas. Unfortunately, inadequate and poor sanitation threatens Africa's sustainability due to its associated health implications on urban residents, which have far-reaching implications on urban Africa, as it may lead to economic losses, distraction of social life, and environmental degradation. Shifting our focus to other infrastructure in Africa more generally, not only does infrastructure need to be built to meet the demands of its growing population, but there's also an infrastructure rehabilitation backlog that needs to be accounted for to maintain aging infrastructure. The rehabilitation backlog in this image here by the World Bank shows infrastructure such as power generation, main roads, irrigation, urban water, railways, and rural roads, and that on average about 30% of the infrastructure assets of a typical African country need rehabilitation. This share is even higher for rural infrastructure. The rehabilitation backlog reflects a legacy of underfunding for maintenance, which is considered a major waste given that the cost of rehabilitating infrastructure is several times higher than the cumulative cost of sound preventive maintenance. So how does African countries fare relative to their counterparts in developing nations in other parts of the world. This table shows normalized units by population for infrastructure, including paved roads, total roads, telephone main lines, mobiles, internet, generation capacity, electricity coverage, improved water, and improved sanitation, listed for sub-Saharan low-income countries in the first column and other low-income countries in the second column. On just about every measure of infrastructure coverage, African countries lag behind their peers in the developing world. This lag is most pronounced in low and middle-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa relative to other low and middle-income countries. The differences are particularly large for paved roads, telephone main lines, and power generation. For all three, Africa has been expanding stocks much more slowly than other developing regions, so unless something changes, the gap will continue to widen. Zooming in on households in African cities, the chart here shows the percentage of population on the y-axis and three ranges of time, 1990 to 1995, 1996 to 2000, and 2001 to 2005 on the x-axis. The plot shows the fraction of the population in percentage terms with access to piped water, electricity, flush toilets, and landline telephones across the three ranges. Since 1990, coverage of household services has barely improved. Current trends and access to these and other household services is more than 50 years away from meeting global targets in most African countries. Even where infrastructure networks are in place, a significant percentage of households remain unconnected, suggesting that barriers exist and that universal access entails more than physical networks. As might be expected, access to infrastructure in rural areas is only a fraction of that in urban areas, even where urban coverage is already low by international standards. This chart shows the same four household services presented earlier, but highlights the percentage of the population, rural in white bars, urban in gray bars, and national in black bars. Although Africa is less urbanized compared to other developed countries, a large fraction of Africa is estimated to rapidly urbanize in the foreseeable future. Findings reported by Kobina et al. And by the World Bank on the previous tables and charts show that the urbanization phenomenon in Africa should be recognized as a complex and dynamic process that has implications for both human survival and the natural environment. The objective of achieving sustainable urban development can be realized through well-structured, deliberative, and engaging processes involving all those involved.